The people of Reedsburg spent the first half of the 40s dealing with the most horrific event in world history, World War II. The war brought hardship and sacrifice to everyone as they struggled to support the war effort and still take care of themselves. Once the war ended, hundreds of military volunteers returned home and took up where they left off, a little older and a lot wiser. Reedsburg began to grow once again. World War II brought lots of stories that were shared by the soldiers in their letters home. Two of these stories are told here. One concerns a farm boy from Laval who spent 3.5 years as a Filipino warlord. He was in command of as many as 25,000 guerrilla troops operating out of the Sierra Madre mountain range on the island of Luzon. The second story is about a letter received from a Frenchman by the parents of a young man who was killed during the Battle of the Bulge, and what they did when they found his body. No farm kid from Laval ever thought about becoming a Filipino warlord, but that is exactly what happened to Bernard Anderson when he found himself in command of 17,000 guerrilla troops while living in the mountains of the Philippines during World War II. He was one of 18 American guerrilla army commanders on the island of Luzon. The Japanese even had a $12,000 reward for Anderson, the bandit. It was one of the highest bounties offered for any of the guerrilla leaders in the Philippines. In 1975, at the age of 62, Bernard Anderson, better known as Dick, gave an interview to the Des Moines Sunday Register and talked about his wartime experiences on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. It was a wicked kind of war, he said. You knew you were hunted. We did some things we weren't proud of. He started out as supply officer with the rank of first lieutenant in the Air Corps, working for General MacArthur's command in Manila on the island of Luzon of the Philippines. When the Japanese invaded the island in December 1941, the American forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula in accordance with orders. The retreating army included truckloads of flour for making bread, but they had forgotten the yeast. First Lieutenant Anderson jumped into a car and sped back to Manila to retrieve the yeast. He was captured on his way back to Bataan, thrown into a prison camp, but managed to escape a few days later with another prisoner. They retreated into the mountains to the east and 4 days later stumbled into a hidden camp of Filipinos. They gave us everything they had, but we lived on nothing. His weight dropped from 225 pounds to 145 pounds over the next several months. Meanwhile, several other Army and Air Force officers managed to escape, and they too worked their way to the mountains. Thousands of Filipinos also escaped to the mountains, and eventually guerrilla groups were formed with the intention of fighting against the Japanese. Anderson formed a small guerrilla army and started training them in warfare. As his guerrilla forces grew, they moved from camp to camp in the Sierra Madre range, close to the heart of the Japanese occupation. As men were trained and were armed, they broke into semi-independent groups under Anderson's overall command. He personally led a company of 400 men. Some of his men worked for the Japanese. They were able to steal a radio transmitter and generator, part by part, and brought them to the mountain camps. They were able to eventually assemble a radio. Using coconut oil as fuel, they got the generator running, and Anderson tapped out his first message, hoping it would be picked up in Australia, where the closest American headquarters was located over 3,000 miles away. The message was received, but Americans thought it was a Japanese trick. Anderson was unable to convince them otherwise until a few weeks later, When the Americans got in touch with 100 questions to verify Anderson's identity, with radio contact established, American submarines began bringing weapons, food, and medicine to the guerrillas. They would rendezvous off deserted beaches, with the guerrillas rafting out to the subs to pick up supplies. Much of the food and medicine was smuggled into Japanese prison camps, where hundreds of friendly civilians and military were being held. The guerrilla army had infiltrated agents into all the major Japanese installations around Manila. The Japanese were also able to infiltrate the guerrilla armies with their agents. The guerrillas started out by attacking Japanese troops on patrol, but stopped their attacks entirely late in 1943, when Japanese retaliation became brutal. They were killing 10 villagers for every soldier lost. The guerrillas switched to sabotage, smuggling medicine into the prison camps and gathering intelligence. They also rescued 27 pilots shot down over the island. By late in the war, they had 25 radio transmitters operating in the mountains, sending out intelligence and weather reports for American air attacks. Anderson was promoted to lieutenant colonel and was in command of a jungle army consisting of anywhere from 7,000 to 25,000 men. In late June of 1945, Anderson stopped in Reedsburg to visit with his parents and sisters. He was on his way to Washington, D.C., to meet with officials in the Pentagon. While there, he ran into Agnes Tiemann, also from Reedsburg. They had gone to high school together. She had joined the Army 3 years earlier and was now a captain, working with the military intelligence in the Pentagon. They got reacquainted, fell in love, and got married on August 14, 1945. They moved to Manila. After the war, Anderson worked as a vice president in charge of traffic and sales for Philippine Airlines. Many of the guerrilla fighters that he commanded helped rebuild the infrastructure of the Philippines. His boss was one of those people. 4 others would later become presidents of the Philippines. The Andersons stayed in the Philippines for the next 15 years, moving back to Reedsburg in 1960 with their 4 children. 3 years later, they moved to Iowa, where he worked as a rep for the Clay Products Association until a car accident forced him into retirement in 1972. Even though they returned to the United States, a shortwave radio became a permanent fixture in their house that allowed them to monitor what was going on in the Philippines over the years. Dick died in 1997 at the age of 84. Agnes died in 2008 at the age of 92. They're buried in the Tiemann family plot in the Calvary Cemetery in Reedsburg. One of the toughest pieces of mail to open during the war was a telegram from the War Department. Telegrams were the sole means of notification about someone missing in action or killed in action. Mr. and Mrs. Henry Dargle received one of those telegrams in April 1945. They were notified that their son Edwin was missing in action as of March 16th. Edwin, who was 22 years old, had been overseas for less than a month and was fighting in the Battle of the Bulge as a member of the infantry. According to his unit, he disappeared while out on patrol and was declared missing in action. 7 months later, in November, the Dargles received another telegram informing them that their son had been killed in action on March 16th. This wire confirmed their worst fears and took away any hope they might still be hanging on to. Another 18 months passed, and the Dargles received a completely unexpected letter about their son. It was sent by Marcel Ritt, a resident of Gombershoff in France. It was written in German and told of the circumstances surrounding their son's death and of his burial in the forest near his last stand. His body was discovered by Ritt's mother, Upon examination, she found his address book. She brought help from town, and they prepared a grave and buried him in a religious ceremony. She felt this was a very heroic death because he helped save them from further hardship because of the German army. He went on to say that the many times he went with his mother to visit the grave, that she would weep upon arriving at that spot. Soon the entire village began to visit the grave, bring flowers, and kneel in appreciation of Edwin's sacrifice. Then one day, the American Army came, looking for soldiers so that they could be moved to a military cemetery. While the village never learned where Edwin was moved to, they continued to honor the place where he had been buried in the forest. Upon confirmation that he had the correct address and was in touch with Edwin's parents, Rick promised to return Edwin's prayer book and address book, which had been pierced by a bullet. Finally, in November 1948, the remains of Private Edwin Dargill were returned to the United States. He was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in the family plot on December 8, 1948. Reedsburg grew by 641 people during the 30s and started the new decade at 3,608. A mural was hung in the post office above the door to the postmaster's office. Postmaster Louis Schultz had selected a dairy scene to exemplify our rural community. The artist was Richard Jansen, who had previously painted a mural in 1938 at Lincolnton, North Carolina. The project was a result of a New Deal agency established under President Franklin Roosevelt that allowed for murals to be painted inside several post offices around the country. A new marker was placed in City Park. The inscription read, "In memory of D.C. Reed, who founded this city in 1847 and later donated this park." This marker replaced the previous marker that was erected in 1923. That marker looked like a tombstone and was thought by many that it marked the grave of Reed. The new marker, a pink boulder, was found on the shores of Devil's Lake. In 1941, the city began buying property along the river, north and west of Water Street. Their objective was to use the land for park purposes. This 63 acres would eventually become Webb Park and the location for Webb High School. Speaking of Webb, as in Herbert H. Webb, the city became the beneficiary of a $200,000 trust fund executed by Webb in the summer of 1944. Even though he was living in Tempe, Arizona, Webb had always thought of Reedsburg as his hometown, even though he moved away in 1908. He, along with two partners, Dietrich Schwake and Gustav Schwake, started what became known as the Big Store on December 1st, 1883. Webb moved to Chicago in 1908 after dissolving his partnership in the store. He later added another $100,000 to the fund. As early as September of 1944, the city began preparing for the end of the war in Europe. They decreed all stores and taverns would close for the day of the announcement. Turns out they were 8 months early. But that day did arrive, with the official announcement being made by President Harry Truman at 8 o'clock in the morning, the day after the treaty was signed in Germany.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
All stores in town locked their doors and hung the signs saying they were closed. Many went to church for prayers of thanks and guidance, for the war was still going on in the Pacific. Life in Reedsburg slowly began to return to normal for the rest of the decade. In the fall of 1946, it was announced that Reedsburg would be one of the 71 communities in the state selected as a location for the new Wisconsin National Guard. Reedsburg was previously home to the headquarters company, 2nd Battalion, 128th Infantry. This same unit was reassigned to Reedsburg along with the medical attachment of the battalion. In May 1948, a modern X-ray unit was installed in the municipal hospital. The installation was part of a 10-year expansion program. A $7,000 unit was suited for modern radiology and fluoroscopy work, and it was semi-portable. The city bought a large lot in June of 1948 at Oak and 6th Street, which became Oak Park. The seller was Myrtle Finch and was purchased for $500. More streets were planned in early 1949. Most of these streets opened up more room for residential development in the area surrounding Oak Park. The city's new public restroom, built on the north end of the City Hall on Park Street to the rear of the police department, opened in the summer of 1949. Demand for raw materials to support the war effort greatly reduced the availability of goods and food for the average American during the first half of the 1940s. The war in Europe and in China was casting a shadow over the rest of the world. America began supporting the Allies in both conflicts. Car builders converted their factories to build jeeps, tanks, and airplanes. Tires and sugar were heavily rationed. Reedsburg Foods Corporation, led by William Shore, bought the shuttered canning factory from the Reedsburg Canning Corporation in 1940. The factory had been idle for quite some time. Plans were to contract for 350 acres of peas and 500 acres of corn. A 90 by 60 foot warehouse was added in 1942. 41 carloads of Fordson tractors entered the state in 1940. This would be the last chance for new tractors for the next several years, as the factory converted to building war machinery. Representatives from the Townsend Metcalf Auto Company, which was the local Ford dealer, traveled to Fond du Lac, where a convention for Ford dealers was held to educate the dealers on the advantages of the new style tractor. The National Sportswear Factory was able to remain busy throughout the early part of the decade. The factory came to town at the end of 1939 when they moved into the second and third floor at 139 Main Street. The first self-service supermarket came to town when the Kroger store opened in May 1941 at 201 South Walnut Street. The other stores in town relied on the employees to pick items off the shelves behind them as selected by the shoppers. A new invention, the base cart, allowed shoppers to roam through the aisles and place their selections in a wheeled cart. Despite a shortage of commodities and manufactured goods, the 5th annual Home Show was held April 1942 in South School Auditorium. Free entertainment was available both days, and many people turned out to socialize with their neighbors and forget about the war for a short time. This was the last show until 1948. This one featured 25 exhibits showing the latest in new appliances and home furnishings. Earl Skinner expanded his trucking business during the summer of 1945 when he bought the fleet of trucks owned by Kenneth Dickey, another transport company. Skinner's Transfer became the new name of the company. In March 1946, the Reedsburg Development Corporation was formed when 50 businesses pledged $30,000 to bring new industry to town. This amount grew to $100,000 by March the next year. The plan was to erect a suitable building that the Development Corporation would own, then rented, sold, or leased with the option to buy to any new industry. The Chamber of Commerce had previously invited new industry to move here by advertising in large city newspapers. There were several responses, but the drawback was they needed a building to set up shop. Within a couple new months, it was announced the Badger Shirt Company of Racine was going to open a new branch factory. They started out on the second floor of one of the downtown buildings. They eventually outgrew their space, and a new factory was built at 350 North Dewey in the fall of 1947, and they were able to occupy the building in June 1948. By the end of the year, ground was broken for a new building to house the Reedsburg foundry on Ash Street. They expected to employ up to 125 workers. The foundry experienced a period of low production due to a shortage of raw materials, which in turn put them in financial trouble. They filed a debtor's petition in April of 1949, asking for time to pay the debts while they reorganized. Despite the petition, the foundry was unable to successfully reorganize and closed for good. The factory remained idle until Grady Foundry, a Milwaukee firm, bought the plant and equipment in the spring of 1951. They poured their first castings in April 1951, after hiring approximately 80 workers to run the new operation. Another new factory was announced the following month when Moe Industries, Fort Atkinson, agreed to occupy new factory buildings to be built in the Development Corporation at the end of Booster Boulevard. Moe Industries made a variety of electrical devices, and the Reedsburg location started out assembling fluorescent switches. Temporary quarters were set up in the Schwakey building on the corner of North Water and 2nd Street for 53 workers. They were able to move into the new building in September 1947. In April 1949, Moe Industries closed their operations in Reedsburg and moved their equipment back to Fort Atkinson, leaving the workforce of 73 employees without a job. However, by June, the Development Corporation announced the commitment of Madison-based Hankscraft Company to take over the building vacated by Moe Industries. Skinner Transfer moved over 600,000 pounds of equipment from Madison within 17 days, which allowed the plant to be operational by mid-July. In June of 1947, the woolen mills began construction of a one-story addition to be used for their finishing department. At the same time, the Reedsburg Brewery filed for bankruptcy in Madison Federal Court. Reedsburg native and world-famous cartoonist Claire Briggs made the old swimming hole in Reedsburg one of the most popular places in the world through his cartoons. However, there's been a long-standing debate where exactly it was located. The question came up during preparation for Reedsburg's centennial celebration in 1948. A call went out to readers of the Times Press to submit their memories of where the old swimming hole was located. Letters began to arrive that gave the exact location of the spot. The problem was that memories came up with as many as 4 locations along the Baraboo River. The least common spot was down by South Park near the Foremost Farms butter plant. Another spot was just beyond the canning factory and the stockyards, known in the 40s as Schofester's Point. The Schofester's stave factory preceded the canning factory in this location. However, Briggs left town in 1884, and the stave factory was the Charles Keith Stave Factory at that time. The 2 most common recollections were just south of the dam by the athletic field and the area known as Brewery Point, near where the swimming pool in Webb Park is now located. Don Holland, a cousin of the Briggs, said that the swimming hole drawn in the cartoon was based on the photograph that he took of Briggs when they visited the swimming hole at Brewery Point. The location with the most votes was below the dam, near the athletic field. When Claire Briggs Jr. visited the city on May 25, 1939, she posed for a photo at the same spot. Also, this spot was the nearest to Briggs' home. He lived only 1 block away on Vine Street. In the early 1880s, the athletic field location was the most popular swimming hole. Brewery Point became more popular in the early 1900s once the city grew enough to have a sewage system which emptied into the Baraboo River south of the railroad bridge, according to City Clerk Will Jerkin, which discouraged anyone from swimming in the foul water below the railroad bridge. Reedsburg Centennial Committee had one goal in mind: make the celebration the largest and best in the city's 100 years of existence. And they did. Celebrating the 100th anniversary of Reedsburg turned into a major production that involved pretty much everyone in town. The theme was Reedsburg Remembers. Committees were started in 1947 to plan the celebration, which was to take place July 3rd, 4th, and 5th in 1948. Once they decided to include a pageant, their first order of business was to hire Ethel Rockwell of the University of Wisconsin. Her experience of staging over 500 pageants in 30 states provided her with a vast fund of experience to plan an outstanding pageant for Reedsburg. The location of the celebration was the athletic field at the south end of Water Street, also known as Webb Avenue. Her stage design was massive. Across the background of the playing area was a 50-foot platform built in order to achieve different levels, while most of the acting took place on the ball diamond. 30 feet behind the platform was where the water curtain was built. The curtain stretched 100 feet and 30 feet high. In the midst of the curtain was a screen that could be swung into position to allow different images to be projected on it from different backgrounds. A portable switchboard with dimmers was borrowed from the university to operate multi-spotlights and color wheels. Rockwell also brought several hundred costumes for the actors. To the right of the field, 5 tamarack shanties were built representing the first housing in Reedsburg, better known as Shanty Row. 14 months of planning, research, writing, and rehearsals went into this effort. In May, a call went out for nominations for the Centennial Queen. By the end of May, 64 candidates were compiled, and from this list, the top 20 vote-getters were announced. These young ladies were presented during the pre-centennial dance held at South School Friday night, July 2nd. Mary Howard, representing Bear Creek, received the most votes and reigned over the celebration with her court of honor. The parade, probably the longest in Reedsburg history, began at Grove Street, went west through downtown, and turned left on Water Street and left again on Railroad Street, down Railroad Street, ending at South Park, almost a mile and a half from the starting point. Wisconsin Governor Oscar Rennebaum and his wife Mary led the parade, along with Reedsburg Mayor Alfred Burdine and his wife Rosette. They then took their positions at the reviewing stand for the rest of the parade. An estimated 10,000 spectators were on hand to witness the 53 floats and 5 bands as they passed through town. A Centennial Museum was set up in the Pine Room at South School. The museum featured relics, dishes, clothing, and tools from the early years, with the idea of presenting a factual picture of what life was like 100 years ago. The museum was open all 3 days. The star of the celebration was the pageant. It opened each night at 8:30 and was followed by fireworks at 10:30. As many as 1,000 locals took part in the staging of the pageant, including those behind the scenes. The pageant depicted early life in Reedsburg in both words and song, and gave a detailed look into the past. The pageant started out with the very first settlers and their interaction with the Winnebago tribe members. Each scene advanced through the century and touched on the highlights of its time. The program ended with the present time. Several animals were on hand as well: oxen, farm and draft horses, and cows, along with covered wagons. A stagecoach, farm wagons, and surreys brought about an atmosphere of the past. On Sunday noon, the Old Settlers Picnic was held in the city park, and Monday featured races and contests for children at Athletic Park. One of the races was a soapbox derby. A special ramp was built for the race. 32 boys built their racers to compete for prizes using wheels and axles provided by the Derby Committee. Winner Arnold Brilla represented Reedsburg at the state meet in Madison later that summer. A souvenir book of over 150 pages was published by the Historical Committee for the Centennial. 28 chapters covered the first 100 years of Reedsburg in pictures and in text. My Life as a Spy. My Life as a Spy was a topic of a talk presented by guest speaker Countess Maria Pulaski when she spoke at the Kiwanians' Ladies' Night Dinner, held on March 28, 1949, in the South School Auditorium. Her presentation centered on her life as an espionage agent for one of the Allies late in the war. The Countess began to speak in a low, pleasing, heavily accented voice. She advised the audience that due to the great amount of propaganda flooding the country, everyone should make sure that what they hear was correct, and the lecturers were qualified to speak on their subjects. Everyone in the audience was focused on the Countess and her story. She was a student of languages in Munich, Germany, and on the day she completed a summer session, she followed a crowd to one of the largest mass meetings that she had ever seen. It was there that she saw at close range the man who would plunge her country into chaos and ruin, Adolf Hitler. Upon returning to Warsaw, her brother, a pilot, flew her and her father to England. Her father was a Polish espionage agent with the Polish Secret Service. Through him, she learned they were in need of a female agent to go back to Poland with the mission of finding out how shipping schedules were finding their way to the submarine base on the Baltic Sea. She convinced her father that she could do the job, and while in Poland, she made contact with a key Nazi officer. She learned that a British naval officer was sending information by carrier pigeons. When the Nazi officer attempted to search the Countess, she knocked him out and escaped back to England. At the end of her speech, she again urged her audience to make sure of their speakers and asked them if they were convinced of her sincerity. She suggested that she might not be a Polish countess. She also suggested she might not even be a female. As the audience stared at her in confusion, the Countess removed her hat and wig, revealing to all that she was actually a man. In his own voice, he introduced himself as Martin Hughes, a character actor who traveled around the country telling his story. The hoax was greatly enjoyed by the audience and became the chief topic of conversation in the town for several days. S&S Railroad. Reedsburg gained another train service when the S&S Railroad began operations during the summer of 1949. However, it was not a threat to the existing train service because this one had its own private track, just 1,000 feet of it. The entire operation was a passion project of its owner, Gus Sweeney. The train operated on an erratic schedule, which was when the chief engineer, head maintenance man, and pilot, which was Gus himself, was in the mood, which was most of the time. Due to the massive amount of secondhand items Gus had accumulated over the years, he was owner and operator of Sweeney's secondhand store. He was able to assemble a very reasonable-looking train engine that was powered by a small motor that had been used to power a railway handcar. As you can see in the picture, he did a remarkable job of building the engine. Parts included 2 ice cream cans, a tank from a house that burned down, a windshield from a Model T Ford, wheels from the Rock Springs Quarry, track from Nisita, and a ship's bell. Also complete was the engineer's outfit: gray striped overalls and a jacket, heavy leather thong for the watch, customary engineer's cap, and a red neckerchief. He even had a string tied around the pants at his ankles. The train, along with the track, was eventually moved next to the airport in Lake Delton. It ran for many years and brought a lot of smiles to all the children who were able to take a ride on the S&S Railroad. Jack Lucht, model builder. Top state honors in the Fisher Body Craftsman Guild model car building competition went to sophomore Jack Lucht of Reedsburg. He competed in the junior division, which was open to boys 12 through 16 years old. In addition to winning first place in the state, he also received $150 and a Craftsman Guild ring. The plaster cast original design model was 17 inches long and 6.5 inches wide. He began by creating the first design in clay. Once the details were worked out, a rubber mold was made, which was used to create the plaster cast. The wheels were carved out of wood. This was Lucht's second attempt in the contest. He entered once before, 3 years earlier, as a 13-year-old and placed second in the state with that model. Boys build models for Navy. In March of 1942, 7 Reedsburg High School students participated in a nationwide program to build 500,000 model airplanes for use by the Army, Navy, and civilian defense forces. The models were built on the 1/72nd scale. This translates to a model when seen from 35 feet away is identical to the real counterpart as if seen from a half a mile away. By studying the model through a standard ring sight used on aerial gun mounts, the gunner learns both identity and range to the target. The models were also used to train civilian spotters to identify enemy aircraft. Each boy who produced predetermined quantities of accepted models were awarded certificates issued by the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics. The 7 local teens were Robert Carroll, Robert Learson, Roger Freedy, Paul Smith, Ray Cooper, Henry Light, and Harold Schultz. The program was in effect 4 months until the end of June 1942. Honoring local military. By May of 1942, over 100 local men had entered the armed service. The FAA Kruger store on Main Street began displaying photos of them in their store window, drawing a constant crowd that was eager to view the pictures. The pictures were brought in by family and friends, and the store cleared most of the display windows to accommodate the growing number of photos. By the summer of 1943, the Reedsburg Roll of Honor was created and was hung on the east wall of the J.C. Penney building on the corner of South Walnut and Main Street. It contained the names of 392 men and women from Reedsburg who were serving in the armed forces at that time. The mural was hand-painted by a local sign painter, Roland Cushman. The dedication was done as a part of a Memorial Day service. Patton Funeral. Local soldier Sergeant Hubert Month experienced a unique Christmas in 1945 when he was a member of the Honor Guard at General George Patton's funeral. Patton had been injured in a car accident on December 9th, from which he suffered a broken neck. The injury paralyzed him from the neck down. He died 12 days later on December 21st, 1945. Men from his company were detailed as honor guards. Month explained in a letter to his parents that he had to stand at attention for 3.5 hours in driving cold rain. Patton was transported by truck to Nuremberg and then by train to Luxembourg City, where he was buried with his men in the Luxembourg American Cemetery. We were riding in the train all night on Christmas Eve and almost all day on Christmas on our way back to the base. CROP. Sauk County donated a train carload of powdered milk to the Christian Rural Overseas Program in the summer of 1948. CROP was organized to solicit and receive bulk gifts in kind from American farmers during the harvest season for needy people overseas. The load of powdered milk was put aboard the SS Flying Enterprise, which set sail for Bremen, Germany on September 24, 1948. Eugene Haug. The Westinghouse Electric Corporation sponsored the National Science Talent Search in 1947, an annual event that looked for gifted high school students. Reedsburg's Eugene Haug, a senior at Webb High, was one of the 40 finalists out of the field of 3,197 students across the country, and the only one from Wisconsin. He traveled to Washington, D.C. in February 1947 with all expenses paid to attend a 5-day Science Talent Institute and compete for $11,000 in Westinghouse Science Scholarships. While there, he attended several sessions related to the contest and visited many of the historic locations in that city. A picture of him presenting gifts from Reedsburg to President Truman was published in almost every newspaper in the country. The Chamber of Commerce had made arrangements with the Wisconsin Senator Alexander Wiley to present the following Reedsburg products: a case of beer from Reedsburg Brewery, a case of peas and corn from Reedsburg Foods, shirts from the Badger Shirt Company, butter from Dolly Madison Dairies, canned milk from Hill Point Co-op, a slack suit for the President's daughter from the National Sportswear Company, and woolen material for a man's suit from the Woolen Mill. Haug went on to earn his Ph.D. in physical chemistry from the University of Wisconsin in 1955. He went to work as the research manager in photo products for the DuPont Company. He made technical presentations in photographic science all over the world. He also held multiple patents as a result of his work. Mary Joyce. Reedsburg native Mary Joyce came to fame throughout the nation when she made a solo trip by dog team from Juneau to Fairbanks, Alaska, a distance of 1,000 miles, a trip which had been believed to be impossible for a woman. She moved to Alaska in 1930 and became owner of the Teku Glacier Lodge, 42 miles from Juneau, in a place which could only be reached by boat or plane. From 1940 to 43, she worked as a stewardess on Northwest Airlines during the winter months. She visited Lake Delton for a short stay at the end of 1948 when her father passed away, before moving back to Juneau. She talked about her Alaska experience as the main speaker at the 73rd Old Settlers Gathering at South School. Over 1,000 were in attendance. Miss America visits home show. Miss America 1948, Bibi Shop, made an appearance at the Reedsburg Home Show as a guest of the Chamber of Commerce. This was her first appearance in Wisconsin. She played several musical selections and spoke to an audience about her experiences. 3,500 people visited the 25 booths set up by local vendors in the South School auditorium. Another highlight in the event was Reedsburg's first television reception. Dick and Bob's Radio Shop erected an antenna on the school roof in order to receive one of the Milwaukee channels, since television broadcasting had not yet arrived in Madison. The first atomic bomb test following the war took place within the Bikini Atoll near Bikini Island. Reedsburg native Robert Arbold, a third-class petty officer in the Navy, was aboard one of the observation ships, 18 miles from Ground Zero. In a letter home, he described what he saw. The bomb hit with a big orange ball-shaped flash that sort of faded out, then a much larger flash. Then the smoke started to come. A great big tower that mushroomed at the top with an orange tint. We couldn't hear much noise, but all of a sudden, everyone's ears kind of plugged up. A fleet of 95 target ships were anchored in Bikini Lagoon to determine blast damage. Multiple experiments with various instruments were conducted. 167 islanders were relocated to an uninhabited island 128 miles away. Bikini Island remains uninhabitable today. Bizarre train crossing death. People, horses, and vehicles were hit by trains on a regular basis during the nearly 100 years there was train service in Reedsburg. Many of these accidents resulted in fatalities or severe property damage due to the usually high speed of the trains. One of the most bizarre accidents occurred on October 7, 1949, when 72-year-old May Byrne was struck by a Chicago and Northwestern freight train at the South Pine Street crossing at 11:35 a.m. The victim was walking south on Pine Street as the train approached the crossing at a speed of 5 to 8 miles an hour. M.G. Wolford, fireman on the train, was on the side of the engine cab, facing north, and noticed Mrs. Byrne approaching the crossing. He said the train bell was ringing, and when he realized she wasn't going to stop for the train, he blew the train's whistle. He pulled so hard on the whistle cord that it stuck with the whistle wide open, and he had to climb to the top of the engine to disengage it. Despite every effort of the train personnel to warn Mrs. Byrne of the danger, it was to no avail. Attempts to stop the train failed to work in time, despite the slow speed. She was struck by the train. Help was summoned, and she was taken to Reedsburg Hospital, where she died at 12:30 p.m. We hope you enjoyed your visit to Reedsburg in the 1940s.